Something changed. It wasn't loud, there wasn't a viral rant, no dramatic walk-off, but if you were really watching, you felt it. The tone shifted, the pauses got sharper, the smile didn't last as long. This wasn't the same version we saw a year ago. In the middle of what should have been a routine conversation, one word stopped everything. Not an insult, not even a direct attack, just a label, and instead of brushing it off, he leaned in, calm, direct, focused. What does that mean? That moment told you everything. Because when someone starts questioning the language being used around them, it's not about being sensitive. It's about being strategic. Words shape narratives, narratives shape reputations, and reputations can follow you into locker rooms, draft rooms, and front offices. For months, the conversation around him hasn't just been about football, it's been about personality, about attitude, about who he is off the field. Anonymous quotes, quiet whispers, sudden concerns that appeared out of nowhere and then just as quietly disappeared. And now you're watching someone who remembers all of it. The energy isn't defensive, it's calculated. It's the look of someone who understands how quickly praise can flip into doubt and how fast doubt can turn into a headline. This season doesn't feel like a redemption tour. It feels like a warning. Because when a player stops trying to win over the room and starts controlling the room instead, that's when things get dangerous. And if you think this was just about one word in an interview, you might be missing what's really happening here. It started with one word and the entire tone shifted. During a casual interview, the host described the Sanders fan base as cult-like. On the surface, it sounded harmless, maybe even flattering, passionate fans, loyal supporters, die-hard energy. But instead of laughing it off, Shedeur stopped everything. What does that mean? He didn't raise his voice, he didn't get emotional, he asked for the definition: calm, intentional, direct. That's when you could feel the temperature in the room change. Because once you slow a conversation down to dissect a single word, you're not just reacting, you're correcting. He understood something most people overlook: language isn't neutral. Words carry weight, they frame perception. When you call a fan base a cult, even jokingly, it subtly shifts how outsiders see them. It suggests blind loyalty, irrational behavior, extremes, and once that label sticks, it becomes shorthand. The next time someone talks about his supporters, they don't say community, they don't say loyal, they remember that other word. That's how narratives form. So when he asked for the dictionary definition, it wasn't petty, it was strategic. He forced the conversation back to clarity. If the word simply means a small group of devoted people, then almost every athlete, brand, or team has one. Suddenly, the term lost its sting. And that was the point. He wasn't trying to win an argument, he was dismantling a frame before it could be used against him later. Because once a label becomes normalized, it opens the door to more dismissive language, more subtle digs, more undermining commentary. By the end of the exchange, the host switched the wording to loyal fan base. Exactly. It may have looked small in the moment, just a vocabulary tweak, but it revealed something bigger. This version of Shedeur isn't letting things slide anymore. He's listening closely, he's choosing his responses carefully, and he's making it clear that how you describe him and the people who support him matters. And if that's how he's handling interviews now, imagine how he's approaching everything else behind the scenes. At first glance, it looked minor, just a quick correction in the middle of an interview, a word swapped out, conversation moves on. But it wasn't minor. That pushback mattered because it showed something deeper: control. For the past year, the conversation around him hasn't just been about football. It's been layered with commentary about personality, confidence, attitude, influence. Some praise, some subtle jabs, some flat-out narratives that felt carefully constructed. And here's how those narratives usually start: with language. One word becomes a label becomes shorthand, shorthand becomes reputation. That's how it works. When someone describes your supporters with a loaded term, even casually, it plants a seed. It makes it easier for critics to dismiss them, easier to reduce them, easier to frame their support as blind loyalty instead of genuine belief. And once that framing sticks, everything attached to it shifts. So when he paused the conversation and asked for the definition, it wasn't about ego, It wasn't about being overly sensitive. It was about stopping a subtle slide before it turned into something bigger. Because if you don't challenge small misrepresentations early, they snowball. Today it's cult, tomorrow it's overhyped, next week it's problematic, and suddenly you're fighting a narrative that feels bigger than the original comment ever was. That's the slippery slope he avoided. More importantly, it showed maturity. A younger version might have laughed it off, let it pass, smiled for the clip. But this version understands timing, he understands optics, he understands that every soundbite lives forever now. So instead of reacting emotionally, he redirected the conversation back to clarity. By the end of it, the wording changed, the framing shifted. That's influence. And if he's this intentional about a single word in an interview, imagine how calculated he's becoming about everything else, from media interactions to how he presents himself this season. Because when someone starts protecting the narrative instead of participating in it, that's when you realize they've leveled up. And that level up rarely stays limited to interviews. This is where things really started to shift. Leading up to the draft conversations, the tone around Shedeur wasn't just about arm talent or decision-making. It became personal, reports started surfacing, anonymous sources, concerns behind closed doors, subtle hints about attitude, questions about leadership. None of it felt concrete, but it spread fast. One week, he was viewed as confident and poised. The next, that same confidence was being reframed as arrogance. Analysts debated whether he interviewed well, others suggested teams were hesitant, and then came the whispers that his stock might be slipping. Here's the thing about draft season: speculation moves quicker than facts. And once a narrative gains traction, it doesn't need proof to survive, it just needs repetition. That's what made this stretch different. The critiques weren't just football-based, they felt character-driven. And when character becomes the topic, that's when things get dangerous, because you can improve mechanics, you can adjust schemes. But defending your personality, that's harder. At one point, even commentators later admitted some of the coverage crossed the line. Words like slander and character assassination were thrown around, yet when the dust settled, there wasn't some loud public correction. The headlines simply faded. No apology tour, no big retraction. Just silence. But silence doesn't erase memory. And if you watched closely, you could see the impact. The energy shifted. The responses got tighter. The interviews became more intentional. He wasn't as quick to joke, not as loose with his words. Because once you realize how quickly perception can be reshaped, you stop giving people extra material to work with. That draft cycle wasn't just about positioning, it was about trust, and when trust gets tested publicly, it leaves a mark. Now the real question is whether those narratives were fair. It's what happens if he proves them wrong on the field. Because if performance doesn't match the storyline that was pushed, the reversal won't be quiet. And that's when things could get very uncomfortable for the people who set that narrative in motion. Then came the moment that really changed the temperature. When Day and Sanders stepped into the conversation, it didn't feel like a normal media exchange. It felt like a line being drawn. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't out of control. That's what made it powerful. He asked direct questions. You said he was kind, you said he was respectful, you said he shook everyone's hand. So why did the negative narrative spread louder than the truth? That's not emotional, that's surgical. At one point, when the topic of the draft coverage resurfaced, there was even an acknowledgement that some of what was said about Shedeur crossed the line. Words like horrendous were used. There was an admission that certain stories felt like character attacks rather than football analysis. That matters. Because once someone publicly admits things went too far, the dynamic changes forever. And here what made it even heavier, Prime didn't forget. You could feel that this wasn't about one interview clip, it was about accumulation, the anonymous reports, the sudden concerns, the idea that confidence was somehow a flaw, the suggestion that he needed to separate from his own father to be viewed as legitimate. That's personal. So when Prime calmly pointed out that lies were allowed to circulate unchecked, it didn't come off as defensive, it came off as a reminder. A reminder that receipts exist. A reminder that narratives don't just disappear because the news cycle moves on. And maybe most importantly, a reminder that they're paying attention now. The energy wasn't hostile, it was controlled, but underneath it you could sense something firm. There won't be as much grace this time around. If you say something, stand on it. If you spread something, own it. Because if 2026 turns into the breakout people are quietly worried about, those same clips will resurface, and the tone of the conversation won't be playful anymore. That wasn't just a father defending his son. That was a warning shot. Then there was the moment with Rex Ryan, and that's when things really started to feel different. Because this wasn't just casual commentary, this was a respected former coach questioning presentation, demeanor, and perception. It wasn't about footwork or throwing mechanics. It was about how he carried himself, the way he dressed. Even the now infamous backwards hat conversation somehow became a talking point. Think about that. When style choices start trending alongside scouting reports, the conversation has clearly shifted away from football. But it didn't stop there. There were subtle suggestions floating around that he needed to separate himself more from Deion Sanders, that he had to step out of his father's shadow to be taken seriously, that maybe being closely aligned with Prime was somehow a negative. That narrative hit differently. Because questioning someone's independence is one thing, but implying that their family connection is a liability, that's personal, that's identity level. And once identity becomes part of the critique, it stops feeling like analysis and starts feeling like judgment. Here, what makes this moment important? He didn't publicly explode, he didn't go on a rant, he absorbed it, but you could see the adjustment. The interviews got tighter, the tone became more deliberate. There was less joking, more precision, almost like someone who realized the room wasn't neutral anymore. That's growth, but it's also armor. When commentators with big platforms question your character, even indirectly, it shifts how the public processes you. Suddenly, every gesture gets analyzed, every word gets dissected, every post becomes evidence. That kind of spotlight forces maturity fast. And now, when you watch him respond to small things like a single word in an interview, it makes more sense. He's not just reacting to the moment, he's reacting to a pattern. Because after the Rex Ryan commentary and the draft cycle noise, one thing became clear: perception can turn quickly. So now, he's controlling it before it controls him. And that kind of shift usually means someone is preparing for something bigger. This is the part most people are underestimating. Because if you just watch the clips casually, it looks like minor adjustments. A sharper response here, a firmer tone there, a little more direct eye contact, nothing explosive. But when you zoom out, the pattern is obvious. This isn't the same version of Shedeur Sanders we saw a year ago. Before, there was more ease, more charisma-forward energy. He could laugh off criticism, brush past narratives, keep things light. That confidence felt natural, almost effortless. Now, it feels calculated. Not forced, not fake, just intentional. You can see someone who understands how quickly the media cycle turns. Someone who's watched anonymous concerns gain traction. Someone who's seen how a single headline can snowball into a reputation. And once you've experienced that firsthand, you don't move the same way anymore. That's maturity. But it's also protection. The responses are tighter now, the phrasing is precise. When he challenges a word, it's calm. When he addresses a narrative, it's controlled. There's no emotional spillover, no ranting, no over-explaining. That's a shift from trying to be liked to trying to be respected. There's a difference. When an athlete stops performing for approval and starts operating with clarity, that's usually the stage right before a leap. Because now the energy isn't split between proving people wrong and pleasing them, it's focused. And focused athletes are dangerous, especially when they feel misunderstood. What makes this feel bigger is the accumulation behind it, the draft chatter, the commentary about presentation, the subtle character framing. None of that disappeared, it just hardened him. Now you're watching someone who remembers everything but doesn't need to announce it. He's not louder. He's sharper. And when sharp meets opportunity, that's when narratives flip fast. That's why this feels different. Because it doesn't feel like someone trying to defend themselves anymore. It feels like someone preparing to change the entire conversation. Here's the question nobody wants to say out loud. What happens if he's actually that good? Because once you attach a player like Shedeur Sanders to a franchise like the Cleveland Browns, the stakes aren't just about performance, they're about narrative survival. If he struggles, the critics feel validated, the draft chatter looks justified, the anonymous concerns suddenly seem prophetic. Everyone nods and says, "See, we told you." But if he succeeds, that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because success doesn't just elevate the player, it exposes the commentary that surrounded him. Every hot take, every confident dismissal, every segment questioning his maturity or readiness, all of it gets replayed. And in today's media climate, receipts don't disappear. There's a quiet tension in that reality. You can feel it in how some conversations are framed. The skepticism feels heavier than usual. The tone sometimes leans cautious, almost guarded, not openly hostile, just hesitant. Why? Because being wrong loudly is expensive. If he steps into Cleveland and flips the energy, if the Browns suddenly look sharper, more dynamic, more competitive, the narrative has to reverse. And narrative reversals are brutal when the original take was aggressive. It's not just about football, it's about credibility. Imagine building months of analysis around why someone might not translate to the next level only to watch them thrive. That's not a quiet correction, that's a public one. And Cleveland adds another layer. This is a franchise hungry for consistency, hungry for identity. If he becomes part of that solution, the spotlight intensifies fast. Which means the earlier doubts get magnified too. That's the fear factor. Not that he'll fail, but that he won't. Because if he wins, if he commands the huddle, controls the pace, and backs up the confidence, the conversation flips from "was he overhyped?" to "how did we miss it?" And when that shift happens, it won't just rewrite his story. It'll rewrite everyone else. Here, where the tension really lives. It's not just about football, it's not even just about media narratives, it's about attention and who controls it. When a player like Shedeur Sanders walks into a city with a built-in following, the spotlight doesn't slowly grow, it arrives with him. Cameras show up, interviews multiply, social media engagement spikes. Suddenly, the team isn't just local news, it's national conversation. For some, that's a win. For others, it feels disruptive. Because attention is currency in sports media. Analysts, commentators, podcasters, they all operate in a system where visibility equals relevance. And when an athlete commands attention independently without needing the traditional media machine to amplify him, it shifts the power dynamic. He doesn't need validation to trend. He doesn't need approval to dominate headlines. And that can bruise egos. Not openly, not in a dramatic way, but subtly. You'll hear it in tone, in how praise gets qualified, in how support gets reframed as overhype, in how fans get labeled instead of acknowledged. It becomes less about evaluating performance and more about balancing influence. Think about it, if you're a lifelong fan of a franchise like the Cleveland Browns, wouldn't you want more eyes on your team, more engagement, more national buzz? So why would some voices sound irritated by that? That's the divide. On one side, you have supporters who see growth, energy, and momentum. On the other, you sometimes sense commentary that feels guarded, almost territorial. Because when the draw shifts from the microphone to the helmet, the hierarchy changes. And here's the uncomfortable truth: the game doesn't revolve around analysts, it revolves around players, always has. So when a quarterback enters the league with confidence, visibility, and a loyal community behind him, it's not just a football storyline, it's a power shift. The question isn't whether fans are passionate. It's whether everyone else is comfortable with how loud that passion has become. And if he starts winning, that divide gets even wider. All of this, the interviews, the draft chatter, the subtle jabs, the narrative battles, it all builds toward one thing. Because that's when the talking stops mattering. Right now, everything lives in prediction mode. Analysts project, fans debate, commentators hedge their bets. It's easy to take positions when the outcome hasn't arrived yet. It's easy to question confidence before it's backed by wins. But once the games start stacking up, excuses disappear. For Shedeur Sanders, 2026 isn't just another season. It's the proving ground, not in an emotional, I'll show you way, but in a quiet, undeniable way. Because if the performance matches the belief, the entire conversation flips overnight. And here's what makes that powerful. If he struggles, critics feel justified, the early doubts get replayed, the concerns sound wise in hindsight. But if he thrives, if he commands, the offense, delivers in big moments, and elevates a franchise like the Cleveland Browns into relevance, then every narrative that painted him as overhyped starts to crack. Receipts resurface. Clips get reposted. Old takes look different under new light. That's the part people don't fully consider. Success doesn't just validate the player, it exposes the ecosystem around him, it forces recalibration, it demands accountability. And based on the shift we're seeing, the sharper responses, the controlled tone, the refusal to let certain words slide, he understands that. He's not arguing anymore. He's preparing. Because when someone stops trying to win debates and starts focusing purely on execution, that's when they become dangerous. So 2026 isn't just a season. It's a referendum. On talent, on narrative, on who really understood what was unfolding. And if things go the way his supporters believe they will, the loudest voices right now might have to get very quiet later. That's the real test. And it's coming.